In this short mini lecture, we'll be talking about race and bioculturalism. These are both important concepts for this week, so it's worth spending a little bit of time on them. And some of the biocultural perspective is a more current perspective that is often neglected in a lot of materials, including the older edition of this textbook, if you happen to be using the second edition. So to begin with the concept of race, we have to think about the origins of race as an idea in European scholarly history. As we've learned through our reading this week, race is a cultural construct. There's no biological evidence for race as having its basis in biology. It's been investigated through many lines of evidence, which are discussed in our readings this week, and I will recap a little bit towards the end of this lecture as well. So race is a concept that stems from culture and cultural meanings. It's not supported scientifically, though that still remains to be misunderstood by a significant portion of Western populations and people all around the world. I still sometimes am interested to see that people don't really understand what a species is, and some people actually do think that there are different species of humans alive on the earth right now. So, yes, it can be a very misunderstood concept. However, it's still a meaningful concept because we as humans give it meaning, and it has all these different effects in our world and in our experience. So to say that it's biological or that it's cultural and not biological does not discount the significance that it holds for people and for our world. So we'll be coming back to that as well. So if we want to really understand the concept of race and where it comes from, it's part of what we do as anthropologists, we have to actually go all the way back to Aristotle and the great chain of being. Here we get a notion of progress that's actually part of Western cosmology, a Western worldview that is not just the way things are, it's actually culturally specific. And of course, the meaning of the word progress implies some sort of advancement. And we can trace this concept all the way back to Aristotle and the great chain of being. So Aristotle, ancient Greek philosopher from around 300 BC. And he was really interested in typologies and taxonomies, really organizing his observations of the world around him. So he created this great chain of being which shows all the organisms of the world known to him at the time in a hierarchy. So you have, I believe, the devil down below, and then you have various rocks and minerals, and then you have plants and animals, different rankings of animals, and then you get to humans where you have women and then men above them, angels and saints, and then you have God at the top. This kind of perspective creates a worldview in which a concept such as race can occur. You have ranking, a hierarchy in terms of different types of people and their standing within the world. Now, in Aristotle's time, there was a thought behind a ranking such as this regarding spiritual essence, not biology so much, but the origins of where we could actually get an idea such as race from begin all the way back this far. In European scholarly history, the idea of race becomes particularly relevant in around the age of exploration. So beginning of the 15th century, you have centuries of European exploration and colonization. around the globe. And so you have information coming back to European scientists regarding all these different people who have different ways of being in the world, different thoughts, different worldviews, what I mean, different customs, different languages, and so on, that these scientists were learning about and trying to make sense of. So a major question came to be, why do we have so many different societies and cultures in the world? And at the time, scientists were working with this based on what they could observe and what they could see, and so many visible differences. This is, of course, a question of human variation. Why do we have so much human variation in the world? And the idea of racial classifications based on biological attributes, physical traits, for example, skin color or even cranial capacity, came to be. And some were connecting racial membership with moral and mental capacities, which, of course, again, we can see the antecedents of that in the Great Chain of Being. In anthropology, our book does a nice job talking about biological anthropologists and shifts in thinking in biological anthropologists. But I also wanted to give an example of evolutionary anthropology, which was understood as I think primarily cultural anthropology set of theories, but it drew on the same kinds of ideas. So evolutionary anthropology is highly problematic, but it's a set of theories in which this idea of progress was placed onto history. So this is a 19th century set of theories in which every society was put on a timeline of cultural evolution. So you have history, different cultural evolutions, and this timeline, and the different societies were then put on different places of this timeline. And go to the next page. So here we get concepts of race in which the evolutionary line moves from most primitive to most civilized. Lewis Henry Morgan and E.B. Tyler, two anthropologists who argued for evolutionary anthropology. And just to give you an idea, they created categories of different spots on this timeline, evolutionary timeline, and had traits defining each. So an example, famous example, is savagery, barbarism, and civilization, or band, tribes, chiefdom, and state. And these kinds of rankings were drawing on this, of course, idea of ranking people, and had the sense that if you were on the lower end, if your society was ranked as a band or savagery, you were closer to nature or more like animals than like the civilized Europeans. And so you have a sense here of a biological basis, that there are different types of people, and they have different biological capacities. So that's still built into this kind of theory. And we have to understand that the context, there's a lot of problems with these theories. They're blatantly ethnocentric and racist. So these people producing the theories put themselves as the top of the timeline. If you wanted to be the most socially evolved society out there, you would be European, just like the scientists creating this whole system. Clearly ethnocentric. And then racist, because it's obviously ranking people in a way that, setting up a hierarchy. And then there's a lot of issues with trying to actually employ these kinds of systems. So what happens if you have 9 out of 10 of the traits? Does the group get put into the category because it has most of the traits, or does it have to be put in a different category? Or what happens if you have a social structure that has both a chief and a tribe? And also, there's no explanation of how you go from one stage to the next stage. And I did want to emphasize that these are not theories that are used anymore in anthropology, but they are an influential part of the discipline, and are part of how the discipline fostered racist ideas about people around the world for a significant beginning of the discipline. And the context is really important because we see the term race being, or the concept of race really being employed in a very specific context of colonization and slavery. So if you watch the film assigned for this week, there's a part 2 that you can watch. If you have time, I do recommend it. That's all about how race, the concept of race, was employed in the what is now United States as a means of political domination. And so that's why it's a key, this context is a key piece of the puzzle in terms of when this term really became mainstream. Of course, as a colonizer, you want to come in and dominate indigenous groups. This was happening all over, and especially in the Americas. And one way to justify that was to use biological race as a justification for why it was appropriate to dominate indigenous people. It's a much more complicated picture than that, which, like I said, you can explore more by watching part 2 of that film, which I believe is called The Story We Tell. So this is part of how the term got brought into mainstream culture, the concept of race. There was a counter-argument, and more than one, as it describes in our textbook. Some biological scientists and physical anthropologists started to claim that there was no biological basis for race. Franz Boas is an important anthropologist, the founder of American anthropology, and known for setting up the 4 fields that we have in the U.S. And he argued against race as an explanation for human variation. He also worked to counter racist stereotypes. One example is that people of his time would argue that the reason why indigenous people, perhaps, let's just use North America as an example, so an indigenous group in North America perhaps couldn't pronounce some of the European sounds, maybe German sounds, was simply because they weren't evolved enough in order to do that. Their mouths and faces weren't evolved in such a way that they could actually pronounce these sounds. And Boas was someone who said, no, that's not what's going on here. Actually, there are really complex language systems all over being spoken by indigenous people, and that plays a role in pronunciation. And so he and his students really did work to counter racist stereotypes throughout their careers. So this is an important step. And he argued against race as an explanation for human variation because he was very interested in history and particularism. So each particular setting having its own unique factors that led to the culture and different attributes that you might see within culture. So there were counter-arguments beginning in the 19th century that have now, of course, by the 21st century become mainstream, but anthropologists are still working to undo some of the harm that was initially done by some of the earliest anthropological and scholarly and scientific concepts of race. So nowadays we argue that race is not biologically definable. And our book does a nice job of talking about lines of evidence that have been explored to show that that end up showing that there's no biological basis for defining race or racial categories. For example, you had the early attempts to measure physical attributes by 15th, 16th, 17th century scientists. They're looking at skin color, hair type, body size, and proportion. None of that works out in order to define racial categories. Measurements of cranial capacity that were done and used as justifications for a long time have been shown to be faulty scientifically. So those studies do not hold up to scientific scrutiny. And then moving on from there, you have explanations, attempts to explain racial categories genetically based on genes. Once genes became understood, that attempt was made. But as it's described in our textbook, more genetic variation can actually be found within what we refer to as racial groups than actually between them. So trying to point to genetics as an explanation for racial categories also fails. And then you have the example of a Klein, looking at different Kleins and trying to explain racial categories that way. So if in a given population, genes don't explain different racial categories that we tend to think are out there, then maybe what's most important is the proportion of various alleles within a given population. So all humans around the world are genetically very similar, but the proportion of different alleles within different populations varies. But when you're looking at Kleins, so taking a particular trait and looking at how that allele is proportioned all around for all humans in a species, that doesn't work to explain racial categories either. So people doing these studies have looked at a number of different clinal maps and tried to place them together to see if they match what we tend to think of as a racial category, and they found no evidence that Kleins just explain that either. So there isn't any way to define race on the basis of biology. Therefore, we recognize it as a cultural construct instead. Still has meaning because our cultural constructs are part of how we understand the world, and we have to also see that we can't say there's no connection at all between biology and what we think of as race. To say that is a bit a bit of an oversimplification. It's important because we're not defining race biologically, but we can't say there's no connection. And this is because two things are true. Race is a cultural construct, not a biological one, and at the same time, race is a cultural construct that affects biology. We come to these conclusions by our biocultural perspective that most anthropologists have. So in a biocultural perspective, neither biology nor culture fully determine human experience or existence. So a human being going through the world is not fully determined by their biology. Also, they are not fully determined by their culture. Biology and culture are intertwined, and we can think of it very specifically that biological endowments, such as our brains, nervous systems, etc., allow culture to exist. We wouldn't have culture if we didn't have brains and nervous systems and so on. On the other hand, culture is necessary for biological survival. It enables our biological survival. So therefore, these two are interconnected. And this is not a genetic explanation of race. To say that culture and biology are interconnected, and if race is a cultural construction, then it's connected to biology, does not mean that there's a genetic explanation or basis for it. This is sometimes misunderstood, especially in medical fields where doctors talk about how they use race to help them help their patients in various ways. So we're going to have very specific examples here that in how race can affect biology. So racism specifically has direct effects. It's been found that the experience of racism has direct effects on health. Studies have been done that show that, I believe it was African American women who had higher socioeconomic status than average had experienced high rates of hypertension. And it was shown that there's this connection between the amount of racism they experience being in this higher socioeconomic bracket that created stress leading to hypertension. And I believe there is another study that was similarly done that has shown that people who speak out about their racism, the racism they might be experiencing, actually can lower that risk of hypertension. And then we have indirect effects of racism on biology as well. So racism leads to inequality, and inequality leads to less access to resources. So the type of resources that someone may not have access to affects biology as well. So for example, if you can't access fresh food because you live in a very segregated neighborhood in Chicago with very few food resources other than the corner convenience store, then you're more likely to have a higher risk of diabetes or higher rates of diabetes as a result. So we can see both direct and indirect ways that racism and biology are connected, or race and biology are connected. And so a lot of times when you hear things about studies being done and what's been found, and especially in the realm of health and medicine, people start to talk about race. Oh, there's really high rates of this among African Americans. There's really high rates of this among Asian Americans. What's happening is you have other types of factors being collapsed into this concept of race. The whole factor of inequality and access to resources often collapsed into this idea of race, or the whole experience of racism collapsed into this idea of race. And especially when it's talked about in medical contexts, I think people tend to think of it as biological in some way, scientific and biological. If the scientists are finding this out, then it must be true, right? So we have to just evaluate what you're hearing a little bit more critically and think in terms of, okay, so they're talking about race here, but is it really, what does that actually mean? That means that something's going on with a population who might identify themselves this way, but it's not actually about race as a biological reality. So in summary, race can't be defined biologically. It's been tested in many different ways, and nothing has resulted in a successful explanation. So the concept of race is created through culture. We have to recognize that. It's still meaningful, nonetheless, because of the way that we employ it and give it meaning. But to recognize it as a cultural construction gives us space to say, okay, we can change the meaning that we put behind this as well. And at the same time, the cultural construct of race still has direct and indirect effects on biology.